Hi guys, this is Neil. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be painting a simple tree. This was requested by Jyoti Sunil Kulkarni, if I'm not pronouncing it wrong, for an easy tree illustration. But before we begin, I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people. Skillshare has so many classes ranging in different topics like lifestyle, illustration, hand lettering, and many more, where you can explore new skills and get lost in creativity. Along with many incredible illustration classes, I've also been taking this lifestyle class by Erin Boyle on everyday minimalism, find calm and creativity in living simply, where she talks about ways to declutter your life and finding little things which might trigger discomfort and how to overcome it. I find that this class is very relevant to the current situation, where it's important to turn your home into a calm environment so you're able to be more productive, to create more art, or to learn new things with a better mindset, so it can help refresh your mind with a fulfilling sense of accomplishment. The classes in Skillshare are divided into simpler lessons where it's easier to understand the information, and members are able to leave discussions as well as class projects to share with teachers as well as other members for feedback. And I just think that this platform creates such a positive learning community for everyone with different interests. If any of you are interested in these classes, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description box will get a 2 months free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. When you support those who supports me, it really helps this channel. And now let's get back to the video. So like usual, I'm going to draw out the subject first so it's easier for you to visualize. I think the key to understanding the approach on this is to look at the overall form of the leaves, so we don't get caught up in the tricky detailed branches from the very start. So for the trunk, I'm just going to draw it as a thin line, and for the top part of the tree, I'm going to only represent it by drawing a circle. And once I have a rough form of the top, then I drew the main large branches right under it. I'm not going to go into much detail at the very beginning, and to give this a three-dimensional form, all you need to do is find the shadow area. So if the sun were shining from the top, the shadow would be at the bottom. So now let's move on to a more detailed tree with a similar base form, but this time I want to section out the leafy part so it's not just one clump of a circle or an orb. This makes the tree look more natural instead of it looking like it's pruned to be shaped as a perfect circle. It's really up to you how you want to divide this, but to section it out, at the beginning I just want to create basic shapes like ovals or circles, and then I try to map out the shadows with the more complex form by just thinking where the light is coming from. You can also draw some roots at the bottom of the trees by making it curve out slightly with uneven tips, or you can just keep the bottom straight. As long as the tree trunk is slightly larger at the bottom, it should look fine. What you don't want is for the bottom to be thinner than the top. That way the weight would shift and it would look very unnatural because the tree wouldn't be able to hold its weight. If you would like, you don't have to make the exact silhouette of a circle. If you find it a bit boring, you can also change up the shape slightly and build it up the way I showed you before with the same method by filling in the rest of the space. So as an example for this one, I made the tree taller. You can choose whichever one you prefer, or even play around with the sketch to figure out the specific shape that you want to create. Next, I'm just going to quickly go over the list of colors that I'll be using for this painting. The colors I'm going to use are burnt sienna, sepia, permanent green 1, ultramarine deep, vermilion, and Hansa yellow. Everything is by Holbein except for the Hansa yellow, which is by Daniel Smith. Before we begin, I want to show you the brush strokes that I'm going to be using for this painting. I'm going to try to make textures and marks by using small brush strokes facing in different directions. They're like little commas, and for this you can play around with your brush pressure to get different sizes for the weight of the strokes. And for the larger strokes, which I would use For the base color, I use the side of my brush and drag it downwards, and this will give it extra texture from the dry brush effect as well as covering more area. And while the paint is still wet, you can add other colors or thicker consistency of the same color to introduce the values to your painting. You can try to practice this on scrap paper first to get used to playing with the brush pressure. Then we can move on to applying the method and colors on the actual painting. It's up to you whether you want to draw it out first or to paint it freehand, but if you're new and it's a bit hard to visualize the whole form, like for me, I'm not used to painting trees, so I found it useful to draw very roughly and lightly so I can work from there when I paint. So basically I just drew out the tree trunk so I know the thickness in comparison to the top part of the tree, and I'm also going to very lightly map out the sections with basic shapes like ovals or circles. This is only to help at the beginning, and later once you get more comfortable with filling in the space, you can be a bit more flexible with it. So let's begin to paint. Firstly, I want to tackle the lightest part of the tree, so I mixed in permanent green with Hansa yellow to create a light warm green color. Then I also added this to some of the brown that I already have on my palette, which is a mix of sepia and burnt sienna, so now I have two tones of greens to work with. I'm going to apply this per section of the tree using full pressure on my brush so I can cover more area and also creating the dry brush texture with it. I'm working per section, so I want to leave some space in between for the moment so there's a clear separation. It's important to always leave some negative space so your tree doesn't look too bulky, which is why I want to create the dry brush texture so there's always a bit of white left. Ideally, I want to apply this to the middle to the top part of each section, but just work on this loosely. Don't worry if it even covers the bottom part of the leaves, because we can always layer on the darker colors on top, which is what I'm putting on right now from the darker mix of green with a bit of brown. I'm applying this to the bottom parts per section, still using full pressure, so you can start to see a bit of volume being formed in those sections. The green here is only slightly darker, so we can still layer on the darker colors on top. So now that I can start to see where the darker colors should be, I made a dark green by adding ultramarine deep to the previous mix. If you're confident, you can use a thicker consistency straight away, but if you're not, just try to paint the darker green lightly first, and once you get more comfortable and you can visualize the shadows more, you can start to add a thicker consistency or add the ratio of the ultramarine deep so it's much higher to create a deeper color green. I tried to apply this dark green in between the sections so the lighter green pops out a bit more, and as you can see, the sections that I have now is not accurate compared to what I drew out, which is fine. The sketch is only there to help you get over the intimidation of painting an empty space, and it also helps you to paint in a less bulky way. I also painted the darker green behind the main stem or the main branches. This way I feel like it gives a bit more depth and perspective to the positioning of the leaves. I'm going to go back to the light greens again, and this time I added Hansa yellow to the green to make the previous warm green again, but this time in a thicker consistency to build on the intensity for certain areas. I'm still using this sparingly so you can still see the lightest green, which we painted as the base. That way it'll make the painting look more airy and light. Now that I have most of the shapes down, I want to introduce a different hue to the painting, which I feel brightens the tree more. I mixed in vermilion to the previous yellow-green, and I used this sparingly as accents to some of the leaves to make this simple tree more interesting to look at. At any point of the painting, you can always go back to the previous steps if you feel like you need to fix certain areas, which is what I'm doing here. Next, I mixed in burnt sienna and sepia to paint the tree trunk and branches. I'm not going to put too much detail on this to keep everything simple, so I used the thick consistency to make sure the lines are nice and distinct. You can design the branches however you would like to, but if you're unsure, you can always draw it lightly with pencil first and then go over it with a thick consistency brown. I'm still using the same brush here because I felt like I could still manage even though I started to feel uncomfortable with them. But if you would like to, you can always switch to a smaller brush for this to make sure your lines are nice and clean. I want this part of the painting to almost look flat in compared to the leafy parts of the tree, so I want to make sure that the lines have intense color, so whenever parts of the branches look too light, I always go over it in a thick consistency because I feel like the contrast between the fine dark branches and the light paper looks really nice. Now that the leafy parts are completely dry, I want to start adding a bit of detail by creating thin marks to suggest the leaf shapes. I'm using a mixture of the dark green before with the addition of the browns and ultramarine deep, and I'm going to place this randomly around the lighter parts of the leaves, but I'm doing this very sparingly. Be careful to not cover too much or else your painting might look a bit heavy because it's losing the lightness from the base color. And I forgot to mention this, but whenever you add layers, make sure you still have a touch of the negative space from the white of the paper. This will also make your tree look lighter instead of it being bulky. Next, I'm going to switch to my small brush. This is a size 0 brush, and I'm going to use the same brown as before in a very thick consistency to paint very thin branches in between the leafy areas, so it looks like those branches are peeking through. Make sure that those branches are always facing upwards as they're trying to reach the light, and try to also paint this near the lighter parts of the leafy areas, or else the fine branches won't be too visible against the dark greens. Using the same brush size, I'm going to paint finer leaves around the sides of the leafy areas, so there's a variation in texture and not everything looks completely loose. You can paint them sticking out slightly, and I also tried to use different hues to match whatever is surrounding that area that you're painting. Then, using whatever green I have left on my palette, I'm going to add the addition of grass. For the grass, I flick my brush lightly from the bottom up, so the top part of the stroke looks more wispy than the bottom. You can also vary the colors for this slightly, so here I use the mid-tone green and also the light yellow-green color. You can also add longer lengths if you would like to, but I'm only going to paint a small portion of the grass so it doesn't change the focal point of the painting. After that, I looked at the whole painting to see if I've missed anything, and I decided to add the smaller leaf textures in areas where I felt the paint looks a bit messy, just to clean everything up. For the final touch, I also added very small falling leaves to add a touch of movement and airiness to the painting, and that's the completed tree. I hope that you guys are able to understand the steps and paint along to this one. Thank you again for suggesting this. This was a really quick and fun one. I think I'm going to actually experiment a bit more with trees in the future. Like usual, my social media links as well as tools are in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!